So how do we distinguish between depression and sadness and depression and grief? Well, in my video on major depressive disorder, or MDD, what we did was outline some of the differences between depression and sadness. But I think this topic deserves its own video to do somewhat of a deeper dive into the similarities and, of course, differences between depression, sadness, and grief. Now, fortunately, I've already done a couple videos on major depressive disorder as well as childhood depression. The links to those videos can be found in the description down below. Now, for the sake of this video, let's briefly review depression for those of you who are either new to the channel or new to the topic altogether. Let's get into it. Now, I want to start off talking about depression by telling you what depression is not. Depression is not, I repeat, not just sadness. Depression is, however, a very complex mental illness that requires a diagnosis. And the symptoms of depression include feelings of sadness, unhappiness, and hopelessness and/or helplessness, loss of interest or pleasure in activities usually deemed as fun, sleep disturbances, appetite and/or weight changes unrelated to dieting, difficulties thinking, concentrating, and making decisions, feelings of fatigue and decreased energy, withdrawal and isolation, low self-esteem, excessive guilt, and feelings of inadequacy. And finally, suicide attempts and/or frequent thoughts of death and/or suicidal ideation. Now, upon examination of these symptoms, once again, we see how complex depression can be because it can negatively affect us in different ways. Depression tends to affect people and individuals cognitively, socially, emotionally, and physically. Depression affects multiple aspects of our lives, including our relationship with ourselves and how we see and perceive ourselves, our relationships with others, and it can also impair us academically and occupationally. Now, according to the World Health Organization, it is estimated that approximately 4% of the global population suffers from depression. Now, this 4% is likely a gross underestimate due to reasons covered in previous videos. The bottom line is that depression is also a leading cause of disability worldwide. Now, what I want to do right now is transition over into sadness since we've done our brief overview of depression. When we talk about sadness, we're talking about a very basic human emotion that all of us experience. It is a completely normal response to events and situations that we perceive as painful, disappointing, embarrassing, and/or hurtful. Now, I'm sure that you can think of a handful of things that make you sad or have made you sad, but some examples of situations that evoke feelings of sadness typically in people include getting rejected by a crush or love interest, underachieving at work or school, saying goodbye to someone who you care about. Now, sadness and unhappiness share key components with depression, but there are some differences. We already said that sadness is a basic human emotion that all of us experience, while depression is a very complex mental illness that requires a diagnosis and affects approximately 4% of the global population. Also, sadness is more temporary, and we tend to return to baseline, which is our normal mood, after experiencing that low of sadness, especially when we're able to discover the source of our sadness and begin working on a solution to our sadness. Now, depression, on the other hand, is more persistent and it lasts longer. We might be more inclined to wait it out for a couple of days when we just feel sad because we can expect once again to return to baseline. But depression is different, especially moderate or severe depression, because it requires more than just waiting it out or a quote-unquote pep talk as a treatment option. I'll do a separate video on common treatment methods for depression in the near future. Now, it's also important to note that depression has symptoms that can significantly impair us for a much longer period of time and in more ways than just emotionally and socially. Depression can also impact us cognitively and physically, as stated before. And one of these symptoms, the thoughts of suicide or suicidal ideation, can absolutely be fatal. Now, we've covered the topic of grief quite extensively on this channel, and we still have more to go. What I'll do is I'll attach the playlist to all of these videos here and down below in the description of this video. But as a quick refresher, we know that grief is a strong and oftentimes overwhelming emotion that includes sadness that we all experience that stems from loss. And many people believe grief is limited to the loss of our loved ones. It's not. Any loss can cause grief, including death of a loved one, death of a pet, divorce or the end of a relationship, loss of a friendship, loss of a job, and even retirement. Now, as I've stated in previous videos, coping with the loss of someone or something you love is one of life's biggest challenges for all of us. Grief can impair you socially, emotionally, as well as physically and cognitively. But these are normal reactions to loss, and the more significant the loss, the more intense your grief will likely be. Now remember, grief is a highly individualized experience. There is no normal timetable to grieve. It happens gradually and it takes time. It cannot be forced or hurried. Now, just to reiterate, some people start to feel better in weeks or months, and for others, the process is measured in years. And how you grieve depends on many factors, including faith, your personality, personal experiences, how you cope with stressful life events, and how significant the loss was to you. Now, there's some key differences between grief and depression. For starters, with grief, there is an identifiable loss and the focus tends to be on the loss. Now, with depression, a specific loss may not be identified and the focus tends to be on the self. Now, with grief, physical symptoms and feelings of pleasure tend to fluctuate over time. However, with depression, the inability to feel pleasure and physical symptoms are more prolonged. Now, we may also express guilt over some aspects of the loss with grief. Self-esteem is usually preserved after the loss when we talk about grief. But one may have more generalized feelings of guilt with depression, and feelings of worthlessness, self-hatred, and helplessness tend to be more common with depression. Now, with grief, one tends to feel a wide range of emotions across time. And with depression, the range of emotion tends to be a bit more narrow in scope, with sadness, unhappiness, and feelings of being stuck being more prevalent. And last but not least, with grief, thoughts of death and suicidal ideation are typically related to wanting to be reunited with the deceased loved one. Depression differs because suicidal ideation is typically related to feeling worthless, undeserving of life, or having difficulty coping with the pain that comes along with depression. Now, depression, sadness, and grief share some very common characteristics, so it's actually understandable why they may be difficult to distinguish from one another. So hopefully today's video was helpful in that regard. I want you to let me know in the comments down below. There are already quite a few videos on grief and depression already available here on my channel, so feel free to check those out for more information. YouTube family, I'll continue building this channel brick by brick and making these videos as time goes on. The purpose of this channel overall is to provide you with information and education about a number of topics, including mental health and mental illness. Oh, we won't run away from that topic over here. So until next time, make sure you take care of yourselves and take care of one another. Peace.